Hello everyone, we welcome you all to another episode of the Cosmic Matrix podcast with your hosts Bernhard Günther and Laura Matsu. Today's topic will be discernment, intuition, and judgment. And these are very important words, so to speak, because they affect all of us. We want to be discerning, we want to trust our intuition, and we want to explore this whole idea of judgment because, it's kind of looked down upon in quote-unquote spiritual circles to judge somebody. What does it mean if we judge somebody or something? So we'd like to explore that from all kinds of different angles and from our own experiences, but the best place to start from would be maybe with some basic definitions of discernment, intuition, and judgment and our own ideas around it.
Yeah, our own definitions, not the Webster's dictionary definition. So we're going to start with intuition. I think that's a good place to start.
Yeah, intuition, because, we all hear that a lot, that people say, just trust your intuition, follow your intuition. And that's great advice, but it's easier said than done to trust your intuition, let alone tune into your intuition. And I feel most people, and myself included, especially in the past, have mistaken all kinds of things for intuition.
Yeah, and I like Gabor Mate does a distinction between a gut feeling and intuition. So gut feeling, I find, this is what he defines gut feeling as. Gut feeling is either dangerous or not dangerous. It's an instinctual survival mechanism, whereas intuition can give you all sorts of information. You could be looking at someone who looks sad in their car, and then you could all of a sudden know that they broke up with their partner or something like that. Like intuition can contain a whole bunch of information, basically, that you wouldn't be able to know just by looking at the person. And also, not everyone is intuitive. We also just have to recognize that. Some people are more pragmatic. Some people are more left-brained. Not to say that, left-brained people can't be intuitive, but it's also, especially people who have water element really strong in their chart and certain astrological placements. So there are more intuitive people, but it's like anything else. It's a skill, and a skill gets better with practice. And a lot of us mistake all sorts of different things for intuition, especially strong feelings. And I just want to share quickly this conversation I had with a psychic recently, because I talked to psychics about how to become more psychic, basically. And I'm talking about honing my intuition because I sense I can feel that because my kind of state of mind has changed, I'm receiving more energetic impressions from the environment, and it's hard for me to distinguish what is what sometimes. But she made a really good recommendation where she said, because I'll get I'm a clairsentient, which means I feel things. So I use this kind of thing, as she calls, a hit of information, where you feel something emotionally. You're like, oh, something's happening. When you get that sense, something's going on. And then she said to tune into intuition, you have to tune in from this place of, what's the word I'm looking for? You have to be non-attached to either outcome. So as long as you have a preference on what the information you're receiving is going to go, whether you want it to go in one direction or good, or even if you have any sort of bias, your intuition may be off. And she actually said that, you don't want to tune into your intuition with your sacral chakra, which is where a lot of our emotions are, but into your sixth chakra, your third eye. So try and tune in from a place in you which is a little bit more impartial, basically. And this went against what a lot of people I see think is intuition, where they have a strong feeling and then all of a sudden they think that that's an intuition, when that's actually just a strong emotional reaction in you. And it could be a strong emotional reaction in response to information that you got, but that's a whole different story. So
yeah, that's a very important point, which I find out for myself as well, that true intuition is not a feeling.
No.
It's what I would call more a deeper embodied knowing. But that knowing is also not just a mental process of just a thought in your mind. Karen Miss, remember she said something similar, about intuition. It is she also emphasized it has nothing to do with the feeling.
No.
And that's a a common misconception, that we mistake intuition for just a feeling we get about something.
Yeah.
And feelings themselves, it's also important to, to tune into our feelings, how we feel about certain people, certain situation, teachings and whatnot. But just trusting your feelings is also very tricky. People say just trust your feelings, just, or the new age simplification. Just do what you feel like doing. Just, think with your heart. That's also a distortion, right? And because feelings can be clouded and biased and distorted through our own stuff that we are carrying on a very basic level, our own, like you mentioned before, our own bias, our own wounds and traumas, our shadow projections, our wishful thinking. And all of that we can mistake as quote unquote intuition.
Yeah, and most often when a strong emotion is coming up, it has its roots in the past, not the present, majority of the time, what I've found out. So, and also when you receive, like, I can give an example. We were in this like outdoor store like a week ago, and I just saw this exchange went on, which was like a millisecond between a clerk and a guy who was in the store. And I realized, he just tried to steal something. And like, there was pieces that kind of I could put together based on what I was seeing physically, but I just knew, and it was just so instantaneous. And I find with intuition, you just get you get a huge part of the picture in like a fraction of the second. So that's how you know it's intuition. And another thing as well is that these intuitive like faculties start turning on once you have quieted your mind. And for the majority of people, like if you're getting into like a thought loop around something and then you get an intuition, I would say majority of the time that's not an intuition, that's something that you created in your mind.
Right. So intuition is instant.
Yes.
In the moment.
And it isn't related to a bunch of thoughts that you were just thinking.
Yeah.
Like if you're just stressing out about a situation at work and then you have a quote unquote intuition that your boss is mad at you for something, that's not an intuition. That's your own thought loop that you've created. You might be right, but that wasn't an intuition. That was created from your thoughts. So the prerequisite for accessing deeper levels of intuition is, and this is what I learned in a lot of psychic development books and from psychics themselves, is you have to learn how to quiet your mind, and then the information comes. Because that's also how we receive information from the environment. If we're caught in our own little world, in our own little thought loops, and our own little like dramas going on in our head, we might get intuitive impressions like kind of sneaking in between the times that we're not having a thought, but it's going to be so mixed up with our own thoughts, and that who are we to tell which is which?
Well, all kinds of interferences that are not our thoughts to begin with, right? But you said also it's very important at the beginning, like with anything else, some people may be naturally more intuitive than others.
Yes.
And you said correctly, you can actually see this in the natal chart, in the astrology chart as well. Some people are more head-centric by nature and whatnot. So there are all kinds of differences, but the key point is, to still your mind, which also implies to be more embodied, right? To be in tune in your body, to kind of be able to know yourself better, to know, it's just basic self-work. The more you work on yourself sincerely, basic psychological inner work, childhood work, inner work, shadow work, esoteric spiritual work, meditation, and so on, you strengthen your intuition. It's almost like a byproduct, so to speak, a natural byproduct. If you're sincerely engaged in this self-work, you come more in touch with the intuitive, quote-unquote, mind.
Yeah, but it's also still a skill that you have to practice. Like,
right.
So even though it's happening naturally, like I was doing this Kriya recently, I did it for like 120 days because I'm crazy, but it was a byproduct, a known byproduct of it is strengthening intuition. And even though my intuition got strengthened, it was like having a horse, but not knowing how to ride it. You know what I mean? So you can have these impressions, but you still have to know how to work with it as well. And I think that takes practice. And I've seen too this common thread in a lot of like psychic development books I read psychic development books, obviously, is that you have to also be able to get yourself into a brainwave state in like alpha or theta, or that can be your natural functioning state if you're really like chill all the time. But you have to be able to get yourself into a less active brainwave state. So usually we're in beta brainwave state when we're doing our activities in the world, and you have to get yourself into alpha or theta basically at will. Like you need to like be able to in order to access like intuition on command. And for the most part, like unless you're actively training your mind through some sort of mind, body, spirit practice and doing inner work as well, because that naturally is going to calm you down, you're not going to be able to access those realms. It's just because you're in this space of activity and thought and action, which isn't a bad space. It's what we need to be in order to get our mind working and get things done. But it's just not the space where these energetic impressions really come in.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. Yeah. What I've also been struggling actually, and you helped me with that as well, remember, like, because I'm also very intuitive, but sometimes don't trust my intuition, you know, which I then relate to, also like if you have certain self-worth issues or I'm not good enough, certain shame, guilt, whatnot, you just don't trust yourself. You know, it's like, to say it very generally, if you don't quote unquote love yourself, you don't trust yourself.
Yeah.
Right. Because of childhood wounding, because you have been not mirrored correctly by your parents, right? Yeah. Because you may have felt wrong for certain feelings or emotions you had, or any behaviors, whatever it may be.
And parents like who gaslight you and tell you that, oh, I don't remember that happening. That's really common.
Gaslighting, you know? Then makes you even more confused about your own impressions. And then on top of what we grow up in a world, the so-called first world, where the intellect is worshipped. You know, in school, we're not being taught anything about trusting our intuition, developing intuition. The intellect, the mind, the IQ is worshipped. You learn nothing about emotional intelligence or the body-mind connections. And it's not to emphasize that, it's not about demonizing the mind either. We can get into that later as well, the importance of critical thinking to use your mind correctly. But it's just this overemphasis on the intellect, and you know, and the diminishment of the bodily impression, of intuition, and all of that. Even you know, the suppression of gut feelings and all of that. Yeah,
exactly. And also with this thing, once you can learn how to also validate your own intuition, it becomes stronger. It's like, you know, you need that positive reinforcement. So I find like a good activity is to, I think we did this on so basically you need to make predictions on something that you have no stock in. So, you know, make a prediction about if someone texts you, who is that texting you, phone call, etc. You know, and then you can start just practicing it. Just practice it on things that like you have, like you're not going to gain or lose from, you know, because the more that because then when we're practicing, because we need to know what that feels like, you know what I mean? We need to know what the intuition actually feels like. And for me, or at least what I've experienced, is a very like, it's not urgent, it's not emotional, it's like a very like peaceful, not a voice, because I don't hear it in a voice, but it's like kind of take it or leave it, like this is what's going on. And it's not going to be like anxious and be like, no, you need to do this right now. That actually might be a gut feeling, but the things that we think are intuition, like no, do this, that's actually usually coming from like,
that's a very important point. It's a very calm, grounded impression that goes, even I feel that's why it's even, like you just described, hard to put into words, because it's beyond our five senses we usually operate in, you know. There's something else, and it's very this calm, like, and it's very sure, it's very, you just know in that very moment.
Yeah.
And it's not, again, like I said, it's not this intellectual thought process that's usually mistaken for intuition as well, for example.
Yeah, so maybe we can go, speaking of thought process, I feel that discernment is actually more linked with the thought process.
Exactly. So I also want to say, why is it important, for example, to hone our intuitive skills? Well, intuition, it's really so much needed in this day and age, because when you think about life is all about making decisions from the morning you wake up until you go to bed. So mostly we make decisions for this rational process. I should do this, I should do that. Or
mechanical.
It's most often mechanical, and like going through pro and con and whatnot. And it's very conditioned through our own mechanical unconscious behaviors, wounds and whatnot, biases, or addictions even, or wishful thinking, what we want to see. And most often, I'm sure the listeners can relate to that. The mind tells you one thing what you should do, but your intuitive sense gives you a different message. And that's also even so confusing when we second guess ourselves.
Yeah.
Right? We get certain insights intuitively right away, but then the mind questions it, starts to analyze it, gets into analysis paralysis. So the mind is telling you one thing, but your intuitive impressions is telling you another thing. And what I've learned over the years through trial and error, that actually the only true response is the intuition or also the gut feeling, and not making decisions from the head.
Yeah, it's like that quote. I think we've said this on other podcasts. A meditation teacher told me this once, and he was rephrasing someone else that sanity is when the body receives the information first and then the mind responds, and insanity was when the mind creates the information and then the body responds. And often you see and this is also a completely different way of living, is strengthening our intuition and letting the mind almost be like the ally to the intuition rather than letting the mind dominate. And that's also something that doesn't just come naturally. It's not something we can will into doing. I feel it's really a prerequisite to learn how to quiet the mind. And maybe there's, I'm sure there's many psychics that have a predisposition to picking up more impressions than other people, but almost every psychic that I've worked with and I talked with, they say that in order to develop it, one psychic actually told me, who was actually born more, clairvoyant, is that he just meditated, and he meditated focusing on his connection to the divine. And the longer he's able to stay in that space, the more his intuition got honed. So I really personally feel that even if you're the most sensitive person, it's like any other skill. I think a lot of people can also learn it, but it's really about quieting the mind. And then, so you want to talk about discernment?
Yeah, that as well, but that just reminded me what you just shared. That's why I can relate to that. For example, you need to make a decision in your life and whatnot, what's going on, and you're very confused about it. And most often we try to overthink and engage the mind and all that, or seek, ask others for insight and whatnot and externalize everything. But in those moments, if you have a problem, about a situation, about decisions you need to go through, that's, like you said, the best thing you could do is sit with it and meditate and still your mind.
Yeah.
Just get grounded. And then I've noticed experienced it so many times, the answer arises, behind the stillness, the clarity comes, but it does take practice. It's not like that's why, like you mentioned before, a consistent meditation practice is so important. Only consistency means on a daily basis. And I can see it myself. If I don't have it on a consistent basis, then, I can get also too much into my head. I get confused. I'm not very grounded. I need to get back also into my body and, get out of the thought screen, so to speak, and clear that. And right there, we hold the answer to everything. That's really the truth.
Yeah, if you have a problem, if you sit with it in silent meditation for an hour, I feel that's a good free solution for many people, Yeah.
Now, I've noticed, that's another topic. We could maybe do a podcast on not just meditation alone, but I noticed the longer you sit, sometimes you actually become aware how you're bombarded with thoughts.
Yeah, that's the first thing. The first thing that you learn, and when you start meditating, is how crazy you are and how insane your thoughts are. It's like that's why they call it the monkey mind, because it's literally like a bunch of monkeys in your mind who are trying to take you in all these different directions.
And it's literally not your thoughts to begin with.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
So discernment. So why is discernment important? Well, especially in this day and age, there's so much information out there. It ties into, we need to be discerning when we seek truth, right? Separating truth from lies and who is to say what is what. So we need to be discerning. And discernment really ties into, I feel, both using intuition and the intellect.
Yeah.
Alike. It's both at the same time.
Exactly, because you use the discernment to also know your preferences and if you have awareness of your tendencies to, and your biases, then you can also have a deeper discernment. So say if I'm aware that I tend to be very swayed by emotionally compelling text, like I know I get hooked in by that, then I can even have the discernment to also distance myself away and be a little bit objective when some emotionally compelling text comes along. So the discernment, it's like having awareness of yourself and how you respond to things, and also having awareness and knowledge of how things are out there in the world as well.
Exactly. So that's why, like I mentioned before, most of us, we're way too much in our head-centric, close to the body and our intuition, and gut feelings. So but most people don't even know how to use the mind correctly, the intellect correctly. Right? That's why I feel it's also important to learn basic logic, basic critical thinking, basic, for example, logical fallacies. When you see, for example, what you mentioned before, you hear somebody talk or somebody present something or try to persuade you about something, discussions, arguments on Facebook. If a person sometimes engages in logical fallacies, you use your discernment. Okay, this is already not, it's already off. I cannot have an argument with this person. For example, what are very typical logical fallacies? The most common one is straw man argument. When you say something and a person then completely misconstrue what you said, it makes a straw man. The classic example is what people maybe have seen with Jordan Peterson, and when he was on a TV show in England, and this woman said, well, what you're saying, blah, blah, but that's not what he was saying. She was completely distorting the argument.
Yeah.
And, so when we don't understand it, we can get into endless debates and cannot become very discerning. Or when people attack us personally ad hominem, or what you mentioned just before, appeal to emotion, right? Politicians do this a lot, and all of that to kind of get an emotional response and hook into your emotional bias or wounds and whatnot to kind of persuade you. And then if you're not discerning and don't apply critical thinking, you can easily get swayed in the wrong direction, so to speak.
Yeah, and also, discernment involves just knowing how, for myself, sometimes I had to use my mind to implement new ways of being into me, even though that's not where I was at. For instance, this is just an example. I had to literally teach myself through reading books what secure attachment looked like. And then I had to use my discernment, which went against my attachment systems because I was either anxious or avoidant, or there's all sorts of different words for it. But I had pretty insecure attachment, I guess you could say. And so I had to use discernment. So when I met someone, even though maybe the part of my wounds was like, oh, I really like this person, I had to use discernment and awareness of my own habits and use my mind to start implementing healthier habits. So discernment sometimes for me means going to know that I'm my own worst enemy sometimes, and then also using the mind correctly to learn, okay, but this is what I value and this is what I want to work towards. And I'm going to go through this discomfort process of my own being because I just know where I'm at. So, it's also just understanding, kind of understanding that sometimes we may not exactly what makes us feel good is not necessarily best in our best interest.
That's a very important point. Yeah, not just only with certain teachings or information, but we even talked about it, discernment in relationships, right? Where exactly, it can be very tricky if you don't know yourself, haven't worked on yourself. Just because somebody makes you feel good or something feels good doesn't mean it is good for you, because could be a trauma bond you mistake for love, or wishful thinking, or shadow projection, a positive shadow projection, and you just go with it without discernment. In that case, also means not just this critical thinking I just talked about, but discernment meaning what you just alluded to, knowing yourself. Knowing, oh, something gets activated. Childhood wound, my attachment, anxiety. Gets activated, or the grasping, or these projections. So the more you know yourself, your own, as Gurdjieff would say, your own machine, your own issues, the more you become discerning and just don't make impulsive decisions just because based on feelings.
Yeah, and also just because you don't like something may also not mean that it's necessarily bad or wrong, because I've known just through discernment and knowing myself, if a teacher or someone kind of like bothers me in the beginning, then I usually end up liking them later. Like that happened. I really like this meditation teacher, Reggie Ray, and at first I was like, oh, he talks so slow, it's so boring, I want to fall asleep. And then I ended up one day I realized I really need different meditations to do that really work for me, and for his somatic approach really worked for me. That's happened to me a few times, actually. I forget someone else. It's been a few times where, and even with
I triggered you.
Yeah, that's what I was just gonna say. Even in the beginning, before we were first talking, I knew, but there was an intensity of emotions that came up. I was in India at the time. And I just knew through my own discernment that this wasn't about you, that this was my old stuff being activated. And I also knew to sit with that and to not respond to it. So for the discernment is really like an inner and outer thing. I think that's really the key.
No, that's funny that you mentioned about Reggie Ray, because I had a similar thing with Sri Aurobindo, which I actually wrote about in my last recent essay, the necessity to surrender to the divine and spiritualize the being. And, listeners maybe know I've gotten really deep into Sri Aurobindo's integral yoga, and quote from reference a lot has really had a big impact on me over the past few years. But when I first heard from him, a friend introduced me to him, I got literally just triggered by his name. Mm-hmm. Because I was like, I had an aversion to this whole guru culture, and something felt just another Sri. I didn't want to take that serious. So my own bias actually was in the way of being discerning, right? And then through other synchronicities, another person gave me a book until I finally got over my bias. I learned to not judge something before I had to looked into, and then read it, and it's like, oh my God, this is not what I thought it is. Yeah. Boom, and that kind of, so you make a very good point. So even with information, we get teachings or whatnot. Just because something makes you feel good doesn't mean it's true. Number one, right? Which we see a lot in the New Age. There's a lot of New Age channel material just makes people feel good, but it's very distorted.
Resonates with me.
That's another that ties into that as well. We want to get into the topic of resonance, or like you said, just because something makes you feel bad or irritates you doesn't mean it's not true.
Yeah, and then also discernment means that. Just because, like, for instance, I really like Gabor Mate right now. He's this, I'm sure you guys have heard of him. I'm not going to explain who he is, but just because I like him as a person and I like his teachings, I also need to practice this just healthy discernment if he says something that just doesn't land for me, because that allows me to have my own individual autonomy and not be like, oh, just because Gabor Mate says it's true. Yeah. Like when we follow someone blind and we just believe everything they say, that's usually also a huge flag that we don't have this discernment. We're just like, oh, just because he says it, it's like trusting these authority figures, and not also seeing that every single human, unless they're enlightened, is also going to have their own biases, their own belief systems. Even when I talk to healers and psychics that I really like, I also have discernment when I speak to them. It's like I can see that everyone filters through their own belief systems, their own life experiences, and just because I like some of what someone says doesn't mean that everything of what someone says is true.
Thank you for saying that's a very important point, because I know I experience this in my work, as people who read my articles and essays know that I quote a lot from different sources, different teachers, different teachings, different modalities, all across the board. But here's the thing: so many times I actually almost involuntarily turn people onto certain teachings or modalities I actually don't fully agree with. I don't want to mention any names right now. Maybe in the second hour. And then they got, reflected back to me, well, you quoted them, so, I thought that you support their work. It's like, no, I quoted a specific excerpt from that person, which when I quote something in my work, is something because I've experienced it myself, or confirms my research. It's just because I quote somebody doesn't mean I automatically agree or support the whole body of work of somebody.
Yeah, right? I get that too a lot because like I've quoted Osho. Even Reggie Ray recently had a bit of a thing lately in his organization. But I don't follow the teacher. The teacher is at least, well, Osho's kind of interesting, but the teacher is the least interesting part to me. Is what they're saying true or not? And a lot of people who I feel they almost like don't have, like their discernment is all about who this person is and what did they do behind the scenes. Yeah, that is part of it, you know, but is what they say, truthful to you? And that's all that matters to me. So I get this a lot. Who else have I quoted? I think I quoted Muji once, and people are like, "Oh,
yeah."
I
Ever
didn't hear
since
about
that
Muji.
happens, exactly.
And then it's like, but I don't care about Muji. I'm not on here talking about how great Muji is. He's the guru. I want to worship him. I'm just quoting something that I've also found to be true. And you know, people. It's like people under the guise of being discerning try and throw out the baby with the bathwater, basically. And so this is a whole other topic.
That's
but when people
but I've seen on Facebook, especially on your timeline, when you quoted Osho Muji, that people jumping on like, have you heard about, what do you think about him, blah, blah, or almost basically dismissing the quote, the content, because of whatever he has been exposed for, right? And not even questioning that to begin with. And, we always never know what truly happened. But that's actually a good example of a logical fallacy.
Yeah.
Right? It's, it also ties into attacking the messenger and not focusing on the message, right? Regardless what this person is doing, is the content true? Yeah. Right? So, but then they divert. I think it's energy.
Because they don't have discernment. And so since they don't have discernment, they aren't able to hear a truth from a teacher who is also flawed. You know what I mean?
See, that's a great thing. People have, that ties into these projections, but that's why also your approach, I have a same approach to, careful of what you project into a teacher, right? The positive shadow projection, all of a sudden you're so infatuated with them that you believe everything this person says. There's no discernment anymore. Yeah. When in fact everybody's quote unquote flawed, depending on their level of being, right, where they're at as well. And I refer back to the quote by Neil Kramer, and I'm paraphrasing, like he mentioned Alan Watts, Steiner, mainly P. Hall, said amazing things, but they were also flawed beings, right? Or characters and whatnot. But this perfection and imperfection, they said, can coexist together. Yeah. So nothing is black and white. And I'm also not the one to throw out the baby with the bathwater, but people are so caught in binary thinking of either or, right?
Yeah.
So,
you're either good or you're evil.
Exactly. So, once person got exposed for something, all of a sudden you throw away all the teachings.
But then you also, speaking of this topic though, then when you read these like exposés on gurus, you also have to have the discernment to look at it from a purely journalistic standpoint. Like, is this person being objective? Did they have a motive here? Are they leaning towards a certain side? And once you understand like basic journalism and how it's hard too, because we have such an unethical journalistic standard to begin with right now. So the norm is to put smear campaigns against the left or the right or whatever. But to be a balanced piece of journalism, you have to show both sides. And most of these campaigns, they really have a certain agenda, especially, I don't want to name this person, but to take someone down. So already there's a bias there.
Yeah, if somebody calls himself Guru Slayer, that's already a big indication of a bias right there.
Yeah, because their identity is dependent on being able to do this. Yeah,
no, that's true. Like, because maybe we've talked about this in the past podcasts, but especially nowadays, people get into this rage porn.
Outrage porn.
Everybody jumps in the same bandwagon, reads an article, have you heard what happened to this? This guy needs to be exposed and this. And it's not to be said that pathological individuals who have abused and hurt other people shouldn't be exposed or shouldn't be talked about, but how are you doing it, in what manner? Yeah. What's the discernment and what kind of judgment? Like you said, it's very bad journalism. It's very like emotionally manipulative.
Yeah.
And driven by sensationalism, which people feed off. Like, it's the oldest thing in book. Like, people feed off like celebrity gossip.
Exactly.
Right? It gives them something to do, to talk about other people.
Just the loosh too, right? Out of this
I can
gossip.
See, we had actually, we can go deeper. I want to, let me talk about, maybe, I don't want to name names in the first hour. Maybe in the membership section we can go deeper. but we talked about this on the forum as well, with incidences, about the right speech and the issue of gossip and whatnot.
Yeah.
And how do you talk about, because we all want to be discerning. We talk about certain individuals out there in truth community and spiritual teachers. What is truth? What is lies? How we can be discerning? How can we talk about it? Right? Because we need to find a way to talk about it and not falling into, almost the new age distortion. Like, I remember this yoga teacher once said at the end of her class, if you have nothing good to say about another person, better say nothing at all. Mm-hmm. That kind of also is like this avoidance can, leave room for abuse and just looking away, from what needs to be looked at. But how do we talk about it? Like you said, it's most important, for example, just to talk about the work without character assassination.
Yeah.
And these kind of things.
Sorry. And where is it coming from too? And that's the true intention can really only be truthfully known by you and you being honest with yourself.
Exactly, because I can totally put the mirror on myself. I used to talk out about a lot of distortions and other people in the truth community, kind of for the nonsense that's out there. But I know for the most part, I've just really just focused on what they said, right? Nothing, no personal attacks, not ad hominem attacks and whatnot. But I can also see sometimes my own stuff get triggered when I get really annoyed by another person.
Yeah.
Right. And so I can see then my discernment is not clear because I'm already have my own bias, my own stuff gets activated.
Yeah.
So I then can see I've thrown out the baby with the bathwater, because we also need to acknowledge on that note that we can never have 100% objective view, regardless of we can be discerning to a certain degree, but our own stuff still gets intermixed here and there a little bit.
Yeah, with most stuff. And also, it just also reminds me too, this discernment, I feel, goes hand in hand with intuition because I just lost my thought in the middle of the sentence. But basically, in order to really be truly discerning, we have to be somewhat objective. And I think there are things you can be objective about. I remember what I was going to say. Okay, so this thing also about discernment also involves your own conscience as well. So and then the conscience is something that you need to grow. It's not something that is a given. So especially with right speech, that was a huge topic that came up in my mind. I think, I read a lot of books on Buddhism, so it's probably, I learned about it there. But there came a point where my own conscience had grown to the point where if I was about to write something gossipy or projecting on someone, it literally felt like my thoughts were creating poison in me that I was drinking. And only you will know when you get that feeling. So, maybe we can tell when other people, or we can have our, intuition when other people are doing it. But that's really, I think, the job for a person, because the more that we're able to be with those feelings and to recognize, okay, what's going on for me in this moment, the more that we actually grow a conscience and the more we actually develop deeper discernment.
That's a very good point. So that goes back to what we said at the beginning, everything is interrelated. So to really develop better discernment, better intuition, better critical thinking, it all goes together. All centers need to work harmoniously. So the more you work on yourself sincerely, the sincerity is key on your basic wounds, traumas, your unconscious aspects, shadow projections, triggers, and all of that. The esoteric spiritual work of meditation, stilling the mind, rejecting thoughts. The more your conscience, your true self comes to the front, the more your conscience develops, the harder it is to lie to yourself. And then where, when you say certain things or approach certain topics or other people, where it's truly coming from. And I can relate to that. There's many people who are not very conscious on the surface consciousness, they revel in gossip, talking shit about other people, right? But the more you develop a conscience, the harder it is to do, because you feel that's icky, literally something else is feeding off of it.
Yeah.
And that's what these occult forces, hyperdimensional entities also feed off of, this lower frequency of just gossip, talking behind other people's backs and all of that, where it's you make yourself feel better by talking bad about another person.
And just from a karmic perspective, no one likes being talked about as well. And the more that you're doing that with other people, I feel just for myself, the more that I'm also opening myself up to more of that too. Mm-hmm. So
again, back to the discernment. So the discussion came up on the forum. We want to be discerning about somebody's work, what is true, what is lie. And so many people ask me, what do I think about this person, this teacher, and that, is it valid, is it not? I'm not the authority here. I cannot tell, I just can share what I've come across based on my own research and experiences. But I cannot say about anything until I have, like, my thumb of rule. Similar to what Gurdjieff said, I don't believe anything until I've experienced it for myself, right? In the sense, or verified it for myself.
Yeah.
And that's really what it comes down to in this. It's a continuing learning. Always.
And I just realized another good way to build, your own intuitive faculties is to work with like divination arts. Like what I started doing is developing a relationship, not a reliance on tarot cards. So every day I would pull a spread and I would see what would happen in my day. And in doing that, you start, developing a sense of what intuition feels like and what's a strong emotion. So there's like 3 categories. I know I'm going back to intuition, but there's really 3 categories. There's a strong emotion, there's your intuition, and your gut feeling. And they're separate things, but they can be interrelated. And then it's also having the discernment to be able to tell which is which and which is coming in that moment, which means you have to have the level of self-awareness and self-honesty to be truthful to yourself. And that's the hardest part, because I find that, I even notice this in like you and me too, but it's really easy to lie to yourself. And we often lie to ourselves about the thing that we're least willing to face. And that's our work for this lifetime, the thing that we're lying to ourselves about. And so anyway,
that's why, that's a good important point. That's why, again, like I mentioned, or we mentioned many times before, there's only so much you can do self-work on your own. Yeah. Because it's easily delude yourself, and we need sometimes the feedback, the mirroring from other people who are also engaged in the work to point out our blind spots or correct our perception sometimes. Because we can mistake, like we said, intuition for all kinds of things, and that, or discernment is off and whatnot. But this also ties into the topic of resonance, of resonating with something or someone. That's a big one as well.
Yeah, because you can resonate with someone who is a trauma bond relationship. So you can be like, oh, I really get what you're saying. So resonance can just come, my wounds match your wounds, or exactly. My projections match your projections.
Or even with teachings, you can basically resonate with lies, with distortions. Because
that's the lie that you want to believe.
Exactly, the wishful thinking. So, that's why also people, sometimes there's truth in that. Let's not forget there's truth in resonating. Right. But again, similar to intuition, you need to be in a certain state of being, not only mind, and have a certain self-awareness and quietness and stillness within to be able to have this true, deeper resonance connected to your true self with truth, as opposed to your biases, your wounds, your emotional projections, your wishful thinking, and all of that.
Yeah, exactly. Like something can resonate with your like wounded self, and you could feel that as an energetic match, but it may not necessarily be good for you.
Exactly. Or like in teachings, there's so many, people say, oh, this channel material, I resonate with this, it must be true. That's, but on the same token, a lot of fundamentalist Christians literally resonate, quote unquote, with the Bible and believe that the earth is only 6,000 years old. They resonate. That's how they feel. They resonate with that. Mm-hmm. So, so we need to be very careful when we talk about our resonance with this teaching. Where's this resonance coming from? Can we truly trust that? Right.
Yeah. So you want to move on to judgment? Is that?
Yeah, I wanted to say something else about
discernment,
resonance, or just what was it?
And it's really important too, that we develop this deeper intuition and discernment, because as you said, there's a lot of bullshit out there, to be honest, and there's a lot of people who I don't deny that the fact that we are in a period of spiritual awakening and emotional upheaval. And we do need a lot of people out there, like working with people one-on-one who are doing this kind of work. But at the same time, we have so many people who are just snake oil salesmen, basically saying they're going to remove your chakras or give you a Kundalini awakening or whatever they're selling. And even just looking at it in a mainstream matrix perspective, like if we had this deeper discernment and intuition, then we wouldn't accept these lies that these politicians are telling us. Like,
because if you're truly embodied, you actually sense that something is off.
Exactly. Right? Yeah. No matter what they're saying and how good it sounds to you.
So that brings up, first I wanted just to what came to me, what I forgot to say about resonance there's also the saying when people say, oh, just, take what resonates and leave the rest, this kind of saying, which also, it's very tricky. If you not really have a certain level of being, you can also just leave what is true and take what is false.
Yeah, or you could be like, leave what's challenging or triggering
just because
for you.
It's triggering you and challenging doesn't make you feel good, doesn't mean it's not true again. That's the important part, right? So, but what were we just saying about other people? So that's a question, I've written something recently on Facebook asking the question, have you ever felt off about someone's writings or spoken words in person or whatever, or through an article, even though something is off about it, even though the words themselves he or she writes or speaks may be true, right? So there's that discernment as well, that a person can be actually appearing very eloquent, say the right things, and I've experienced it many times, I'm sure you as well, but energetically something feels off. There's another impression you're getting. Yeah,
because words are just words. We have to keep that in mind. Like, doesn't matter, like, this teacher I was listening to recently, she mentioned about how, people in yoga classes or whatever workshops would be like, to say you are safe here, that's just you saying you're safe. Like, how does that person actually feel? Are they safe here? So you can say whatever you want. It doesn't actually mean that that's really what's going on. Like, this is also tying in again about how we worship the intellect, how I think a lot of us fall into like wishful thinking. If someone says something, you want to believe it's true. But to be honest, like, words are just words. It's just the actions and the level of being are what really back it up.
And that's a big issue I feel nowadays on the internet, especially social media, because anybody who has like some good grammar, vocabulary, is good in writing, can regurgitate any truth, spiritual wisdom and whatnot, right? But it doesn't necessarily reflect their level of being and awareness and embodiment at all, just because they're eloquent in presenting it.
Yeah.
Right? And then people project onto that person and whatnot.
And just
go ahead. Yeah.
And just because, like, I even know for myself, just because someone's written something, that doesn't mean that they're living that reality all the time. That's the kind of person they are. Like, I've written things that come from a way higher place than my normal frequency. It's like what I'm striving towards, but doesn't mean that I'm always in that space. So.
Yeah, and even on a more pathological level, I know that very intellectually gifted people can purposely manipulate others via almost like NLP techniques, right? And intellectual sophism, even like it's known that psychopaths, actually high functioning psychopaths in society in place of higher power, have a high IQ, are very intelligent, hiding behind the mask of sanity, and are masters in manipulation through their words, appearing as very empathetic and eloquent and understanding and whatnot. But the internal landscape is a whole different story, right? Yeah,
I think you can move on to judgment, because I'm just noticing that we have some 13 minutes left.
Move on, that's so. But I want to go deep into that. Maybe we can do in the second hour.
Yeah, in the second hour.
We have a whole nother.
Yeah.
But judgment. But that's.
Yeah, judgment.
Yeah. That's a big word too, right? This
is the last one. Yeah, and everyone's saying don't judge, and I feel that truly the only person who can judge is the divine or God. Like, that's the person who actually is, quote unquote, judging on a higher level but I don't even think it's judgment in that sense. But I feel it's more like this karmic equalizer. Judgment is more related to like justice, and I feel, just as my own interpretation, by the way, you can take it or leave it, but it's,
if you resonate with it or not.
Yeah, if you resonate with it or not. But judgment involves, like, for myself on a day-to-day basis, it's also linked to conscience and my conscience, but it's like, what are my ethics and values on what is right or wrong with just within my own life? We could have I don't want to get a whole conversation about ethics here, but just in what my values are. And that's how I decide, like, I can make a judgment whether or not I want to work with a client or not. I'm making a judgment there. It's not that I'm making a judgment about them or their journey. It's just, is this the right choice for me, based on intuition, based on discernment, and also based on what my values are. Like, I even recognize now, like, I can't work with every single person who comes to me, but there's certain people who I work really well with, you know, so it's able to make those kinds of, so judgment isn't a good or bad thing.
It ties more into discernment even every day, like also ties into making appropriate boundaries, right?
Yeah. Yeah, but I feel that like what people in the New Age define as judgment is when it's also linked to discernment as well, as like, no, we should just see everything equally. We should have no preferences. And the reality is that is not true. It's like you always are going to have preferences. You even have a preference not to have a preference. So like you can't escape that. Your soul is also developed to have certain likes and dislikes. That's just the reality. It doesn't mean that you're guided. You have to be completely guided by that, but you just have to acknowledge that that's going to be present.
Exactly. And because we're all in the process of individualizing, awakening and whatnot, so we still have our own biases, our karma, you know, our past actions affect also our likes and dislikes and whatnot on so many different levels and unconscious ways we're not actually aware of at all, right? We all have these preferences to a degree. We don't even really know where they come from, maybe from childhood. You know, could be, you know, childhood wounding or just habit, so to speak, or past life. But you're right. I feel in the New Age, when people say don't judge, then they throw out everything with the baby with the bathwater, including discernment, right? And everything needs to accept it, equality and all of that. Yeah. Because everything is one, they mistake oneness, think that everybody is the same as well and we're all equal. Yeah. Not understanding that one is true, one is also from the spiritual perspective recognizes difference. Yeah. Right. And within that, we need to be discerning, you know, especially also what is coming from our lower nature, from our, you know, egoic self, and what is coming more from our true higher self. You know, that's already a discernment right there, which is important in any esoteric teaching, right? They talk about like the rejection of, you know, Sri Aurobindo talks about the rejection of the lower nature in these vital impulses and acceptance of this higher truth. So there's a discernment right there, and you can say it's a quote unquote judgment, but it's more of that inner discernment. I
think what they mean when they say like New Age people like don't judge, they think that people are making snap decisions based on emotional biases. And that's, to me, like, maybe this is my Libra side, but when I'm going to like judge something, make a decision based on my own preferences, I take in, I mean, ideally, I should take in both sides of the equation. Like, what would it be if I like made this decision or that decision? And then also understanding my intentions and what my values are, and then making a judgment that's in alignment with taking me closer to my higher values and not just what my mind says I should do or whatever other programming.
Yeah. And I also feel judgment gets distorted when, you know, definitely when you have a very negative projection, you can see something, oh, this is a pathological individual psychopath. But if you project your hate and anger onto it, this is an evil, you know, that's you're doing a quote unquote false judgment because it's filtered through your own hate and issues. And you're actually you're playing in that game that you're trying to expose, so to speak. Yeah. Right. That kind of lower self egoic consciousness. But I think it's very important what you mentioned at beginning when we talked about judgment. To judge truly, you need to be on the level of the divine and see with the eyes of the divine.
And a lot of the judgments we have against other people are pure shadow projection, meaning we judge something in ourselves or we've repressed it in ourselves, and then we judge other people really harshly. Especially
if it's very emotionally driven, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So, yes, let me think that's perfect timing to finish the first hour with this quote by the mother. And here she goes. Until your vision is constantly the vision of the divine in all things, you have not only no right, but no capacity to judge the state which others are in. And to pronounce a judgment on someone without having this vision spontaneously, effortlessly, is precisely an example of the mental presumptuousness of which Sri Aurobindo always spoke. And it so happens that one who has the vision, the consciousness, who is capable of seeing the truth in all things, never feels the need to judge anything whatever. For he understands everything and knows everything. Therefore, once and for all, you must tell yourselves that the moment you begin to judge things, people, circumstances, you're in the most total human ignorance. In short, one could put it like this. When one understands, one no longer judges. And when one judges, it means that one doesn't know. Judging people is one of the first things which must be totally swept away from the consciousness before you can take even a step on the supramental path. Because that is not a material progress or a bodily progress. It is only a very little progress of thought, a mental progress. And unless you have swept your mind clean of all its ignorance, you cannot hope to take a step on the supramental path. All those who have truly and sincerely had the experience of the divine presence, all those who have truly been in contact with the divine, have always said the same thing, that sometimes, even often, it is in what is most decried by men, most despised by men, most condemned by human, quote, wisdom, that one can see the divine light shining. They are not mere words, they are living experiences. All these ideas of good and evil, good and bad, higher, lower, all these notions belong to the ignorance of the human mind. And if one really wants to come in contact with the divine life, one must liberate oneself totally from this ignorance. One must rise to a region in consciousness or of consciousness where these things have no reality. The feeling of superiority or inferiority completely disappears. It is replaced by something else, which is of a very different nature, a sort of capacity for filtering appearances, penetrating behind masks, shifting the point of view. And these are not mere words. It is altogether true that everything changes its appearance, totally, that life and things are completely different from what they appear to be. All this contact, this ordinary perception of the world loses its reality completely. This is what appears unreal, fantastic, illusory, non-existent. There's something very material, very concrete, very physical, which becomes the reality of the being and which has nothing in common with the ordinary way of seeing. When one has this perception, the perception of the work of the divine force, of the movement being worked out behind the appearance, in the appearance, through the appearance, one begins to be ready to live something truer than the ordinary human falsehood, but not before. And with that being said, let's talk more about discernment, intuition, and judgment. In the second hour, if you're not already a member, go to my website, veilofreality.com. You can sign up there and have also access to the forum where we discuss these and other topics as well.
And we also have live monthly group calls on Zoom.
That's true. They're really nice too. We meet once a month all together. There's a Zoom link posted on the forum, and have a live Zoom call, which also will be recorded and accessible for anybody on the membership. All right, guys. See you in the second hour.